So we continue today with looking at what happened to the disciples of Christ in the 20th century after the split. Don't forget that the last of the restoration of the ancient order of things reflection essay is due a week from tomorrow. That's April 14th, and the critical review of David Lipscomb's On Civil Government is due the week after that. And I've forgotten to adjust that link, and so I'll try and get that link adjusted this afternoon. I apologize for that. It had slipped my mind. And then, of course, I will get that adjusted, so it should be available this afternoon. We finished up on Tuesday by looking at the ways in which the disciples of Christ started to institutionalize in the 20th century by consolidating and centralizing some elements, particularly the United Christian Missionary Society, an early 20th century group that was meant to tie together a lot of the missionary efforts of the disciples. You remember, of course, the development of the American Christian Missionary Society in the 19th century, was an effort to try and kind of coordinate, inform the restoration movement of efforts that were going on that were more about the evangelizing and trying to coordinate some of that, with there being some opposition to it and some in support with it. Largely, of course, when the disciples and the churches of Christ split in the 20th century, well, the late 19th into the 20th century, most of those in the disciples supported the idea of missionary societies to coordinate effort. But in that latter 19th century period, of course, they had developed a variety of organizations that were focused on specific elements of missionary efforts. We talked about the Foreign Christian Missionary Society, the Christian Women's Board of Missions. There were other groups as well focused on missions, and then also there were a variety of other organizations like that developed related to concerns or issues related to ministers, recruitment of ministers, taking care of ministers after retirement age, benevolence, other types of things that we're really concerning about. And so all of those organizations, not all of those, many of those organizations were brought together in the early 20th century under the United Christian Missionary Society in an effort to kind of coordinate all these efforts. And as we also noted on Tuesday, that with having so many different organizations related to sometimes very similar overlapping type of issues, it became a almost burden, or at least a lot of congregations and ministers felt it was a burden, to receive donation requests from all of those different organizations. And so, this would be an effort to kind of consolidate that and cooperate and kind of centralize that those financial appeals. And so there were a variety of ways in which the disciples attempted to demonstrate this. And we talked briefly about the Men in Millions movement, which was prior to the United Christian Missionary Society, but was pointed to as an effort of what good could be done with centralization, with cooperation, as far as fundraising goes, as far as enlisting individuals to give themselves full-time to ministerial and missionary work. And so, there was another thing that was brought in as an example of ways in which the disciples, if they had a centralized organization that oversaw all of those elements, they could be more successful than perhaps working on their own or having so many different organizations. And so, what essentially we're seeing here is this development of an organization that theoretically is kind of a centralizing of a bunch of different societies that did not have there wasn't significant opposition to some of these societies prior to this point, but with the centralization, with the pulling all of these things together under one organization, that's when some people started to become concerned. One concern had to do with the issue of congregational autonomy. Ever since the earliest days of the Restoration movement in the 19th century, there has been an emphasis on individual congregations making decisions for themselves and not having an outside source telling them how to operate, how to run, what things to do, what things to not do. Now, certainly there was a place for individual preachers and teachers, journal authors to write about particular issues going on in the Restoration movement and various congregations sometimes to try and identify things that the congregation should consider doing, or things, or sometimes teachers congregations should consider avoiding. But this was more of a loose type of centralization than any sort of extreme situation where there was significant authority. Now, in a sense, these editors of journals, the first wave, like Alexander Campbell, Barton W. Stone, others, you have that, and then you have that second wave, this kind of second generation where you get the Gospel Advocates, other journals within the Churches of Christ, eventually the Christian Standard, other journals within the Disciples of Christ, and sometimes these individuals were looked upon as kind of very important. They've been referred to by scholars as editor bishops. They were editors of journals, but they operated like a bishop would in a situation. So there is kind of this loose, scholars would claim, this loose kind of denominational hierarchy in that here are these editors of influential journals, often wielding a lot of influence and sometimes even authority in what is ostensibly a group that emphasizes congregational autonomy. So how can a journal author, a journal editor really seek to claim any sort of influence? The response, of course, would be, or one of the responses could be, that even though you see that, there is some sort of authority that is being taken up there, you see something similar taking place in early Christianity. Now, certainly, the editor bishops of the early Restoration movement would not have claimed to have been authoritative like the apostles were, and they certainly wouldn't have claimed any sort of inspiration. But after that second generation, after the apostles, you see a variety of early Christians providing similar types of guidance, writing to congregations, people like Ignatius, Clement, Polycarp, some things like that, where the congregations are still autonomous, but there is this persuasive type of authority being enacted in some places to try and encourage a congregation to consider either what they're doing or what they're not doing. So there was kind of this element of persuasive authority that existed in the Restoration movement, but largely the congregations were autonomous. Now there were, sometimes coercion could be used, light persuasive coercion. Coercion might not be a good term, but you kind of try and forcefully persuade a congregation by threatening to abandon fellowship or to break fellowship if they don't adjust what they're doing. Right? If they're following the teachings of a particular teacher whose ideas are viewed as unscriptural, you don't have the authority to try and make them reject those teachings, but you can kind of say, if you persist in this, it's going to cause us to break fellowship. it is coercive. It is an expectation of certain types of authority, but ultimately, it's not forcing that congregation. That congregation and its leadership has to make a decision about whether or not they are going to, which is more important, right? Their allegiance to what's being taught or their connection with the larger Christian community. So, the idea of having this unified missionary society was very concerning because there were several people, even within the disciples of Christ, that looked upon this as a lessening of congregational autonomy. And so that was one concern. Another concern that was developing with respect to where the trajectory of the disciples of Christ is going is it's situating itself within the denominations, particularly liberal Protestant denominations of the time. Now, this was particularly troubling for the theological conservatives in the group, people that still had traditional ideas about the Bible, its authorship, inspiration, other issues, other ideas like that. And as the Federal Council of Churches developed, it was essentially this kind of organization that's developing to kind of be a national organization across denominations. Many of them liberal Protestant. So a lot of the fundamentalist churches did not become members of the Federal Council of Churches. It's mostly the liberal Protestant groups that are working together here. And so the idea here is cooperation, ecumenism, while still holding on to your denominational identity. You're a part of the Federal Council of Churches, but you're still Presbyterian, you're still Methodist, things like that. So there were two problems here for the more theologically conservative of the group. First was that this is a liberal Protestant group, and it further moves the disciples along the liberal Protestant line. And so that was a concern. The additional concern was that by becoming a part of the Federal Council of Churches, that was making disciples into, or at least identifying the disciples as a denomination. In many respects, the theological conservatives within the disciples still held on to the idea of wanting to create a non-denominational Christianity. That they were trying to hold on to the idea of restoration of the New Testament church. Where the theologically liberal disciples were tending to look upon the movement as another denomination within the larger denominational landscape of the United States and the world, for that matter. So they didn't have as much of a problem with adopting a denominational identity. And even here, they could have appealed to the writings of Alexander Campbell, who in the 1840s and on had been using phrases like our denomination. Now, even though Campbell had not intended to start a new denomination, his desire was to be anti or non-denominational. But even Campbell was recognizing by the latter part of his life that there were elements of the Restoration movement that was becoming another denomination. His hope for this mass exodus from denominations into a movement that would have renounced all of those things was not occurring. So he started using these phrases like our denomination. Phrases that a lot of other people in the Restoration movement weren't ready to adopt or accept. But for the disciples to accept a place among the Federal Council of Churches was to relinquish the non-denominational identity of the movement and accept that it was just one more denomination in the history of Christian division after the Protestant Reformation. Additionally, by doing that and participating in an ecumenical organization like the Federal Council of Churches, a lot of the more theologically conservative disciples saw this as abandoning certain efforts to other denominations. So, for example, there were some places where the United Christian Missionary Society had been engaged in evangelistic endeavors outside of the United States, but kind of pulled the missionaries back from certain places and allowed the Methodists to, be active missionarily in that area. So, it really became a place where here is this movement, and if you're a theological conservative, you're concerned about the theological liberals in your own movement and what direction that's going to take your movement. Then you have a relinquishing of certain aspects of your identity, which you think are very, very important to who you are as a movement. Then you have the relinquishing of areas of missionary work to other organizations, and so it became a very great concern for the theological conservatives because of where they saw this taking the movement. Furthermore, the involvement of the disciples in the InterChurch World Movement was also troubling. The InterChurch World Movement was an ecumenical organization that was started by Presbyterians. And the focus of the group was to evangelize the world by bringing different denominations together to cooperatively work together, send out missionaries, and convert the entire world. Well, that sounds like something that most disciples would have been against traditionally because of this kind of, it persists the division in Christianity instead of bringing about unity. Other disciples thought, well, no, this is what we've been looking for. We are working together. And so many of the disciples' leadership, the United Christian Missionary Society, got involved in this InterChurch World Movement. Well, the funding for the movement was based on loans taken by various denominations. And so that was, that's where the funding came from, was these various denominations got bank loans and pulled their money together. Well, the movement lasted 2 or 3 years. It wasn't very successful, which meant that as it deteriorated, those denominations, including the disciples, were on the hook for whatever bank loans that they had taken out. And for the disciples, it was about $600,000. Now we're talking, 1920s. So a rather sizable amount, especially, even though the disciples tended to be the more middle class, upper class level of the Restoration movement, there was still, that was still a sizable amount of money. Now, fortunately, the leadership of the United Christian Missionary Society was very active about that, and it did not take too long before that debt was paid off. But that really kind of was a big concern for a lot of disciples. So there were other things that also became problematic in the time period after the United Christian Missionary Society, like the controversy over open membership, which we'll talk about later. But essentially, these efforts by the United Christian Missionary Society ended up not uniting the efforts of the disciples, but actually ending up dividing it, as some congregations who were very concerned, sometimes suspicious of the society, ended up kind of going around the society and supporting their own missionary efforts instead of going through the society, so that you have individual congregations supporting missionaries. Instead of, as what was encouraged was, funnel all the money through this United Christian Missionary Society, and that group would oversee missionary work of the disciples. So it ended up hindering the missionary endeavors both at home in the United States and on the mission field. And this controversy even led to some of the organizations that had become a part of the society kind of splitting back off so that they could focus on their particular issues that they were concerned about. Particularly those that were focused on issues related to education or benevolence, and those ministerial concerns that we talked about. Many of those were ones that pulled away for some time. But after some of this rocky start, eventually the society started to gain some ground and would organize into 3 different divisions focused on specific issues. So on one hand you have the Division of Christian Education, so focused on education, colleges, those kind of things. Then there was the Division of Home Missions, focused on evangelistic efforts in the United States, and then the Division of Foreign Missions, which was focused on missionary work in other countries. So all of these organizations kind of split out as the United Christian Missionary Society begins to take root and as it begins to gain some ground. Other efforts were made to unify the disciples and bring some structure to them. So one was the Missionary Society, like we talked about. Another was kind of more of a structure to the activity of the group. So in 1909, the disciples planned for a celebration to remember the centennial of the centennial anniversary of the Declaration and Address. So the Declaration and Address, published in 1809, the 100-year anniversary of that would be 1909. And so they thought, well, it'd be a good time to observe an anniversary, talk about where we've been, where we're going, those kind of things. And so this convention is developed to be held in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania in 1909. And it was also determined that as part of that convention, it wouldn't just be an honoring of the 1809 Declaration and Address, but look at where have disciples been, where have they come from, where are they going, talk about the different achievements that have taken place. And many of the organizers as well thought that it would be a good time to call for more centralization and organization within the disciples. So the centennial anniversary led to this effort to try and bring more unity to. The first international convention of the Disciples of Christ, what eventually becomes known as the International Convention of Christian Churches, Disciples of Christ, was called in 1917, and a variety of issues were developed, or not a variety of issues, a variety of ideas were put forth as to how the group might bring about a unifying, centralizing type of organization. Well, some people were concerned that this would make the disciples more denominational, and something that they had historically tried to avoid. Others just didn't like the idea that was brought forth, but eventually a decision was made to create the International Convention of Christian Churches, Disciples of Christ. And it would be kind of a legislative body in a sense, in that various delegates from the different states, different congregations, would be representing those places as the groups met at various times. Any decisions that were made by the International Convention were to be advisory only. So it wasn't that they were passing down laws that the congregations had to follow. But others were still concerned that this was, a possibility of losing more autonomy. Part of this, of course, led to the formation of the United Christian Missionary Society. The goal here being to promote cooperation, to promote efficiency in carrying out certain efforts, as well as bring the churches together in closer fellowship. Well, as we've seen in other things, there were a variety of concerns. Some did not like the direction that the International Convention was taking. They didn't like that it was becoming more denominationally minded. And so, especially the meetings, a lot of people felt that those meetings of the disciples should be times to encourage each other, inspire each other, listen to some preaching, but it was handling more business types of issues. And some were concerned about that, thinking that, this is, more of a denominational structure, and previous meetings and organizations like this had just been about bringing churches together to talk about what was going on, to share time together, to inspire each other, those kind of things. So there's those kinds of concerns. The denominational structure, the direction that the International Convention was taking. But a third issue that became very concerning was a controversy over open membership. Now, also related to this is what's often referred to as the question of the pious unimmersed. So, within the Restoration movement, the teaching since very early on had been that baptism was necessary for salvation. Now, in those early years, there was some difference about this. It took a while for some early leaders to be on board with that. Weren't fully convinced about it for a while. But eventually, most people in the Restoration movement believed that the moment of immersion was the moment that salvation occurred. Not necessarily any sort of idea about works or that there was something special in the water, but that was the moment where you, in your obedience to Christ, your faithful obedience to Christ, that God applied the blood of Christ to you. And so salvation occurred at baptism. So if that's true, what do you do then? And I mean, this is still an issue even today, but this was an issue that came up. How do you regard those people in other organizations who do not practice either immersion or don't practice adult baptism? Right? They practice sprinkling or pouring, or they baptize infants, those kinds of things. How do you understand those people who are committed, who are religious, who are pious, but they are unimmersed? Well, Campbell, as we've seen in many of his early debates, focused on the issue of baptism and what occurs in baptism, and continually emphasized the importance of baptism for salvation. But by the 1830s, he was taking a slightly different position, still emphasizing the importance of immersion for salvation, but he also began to indicate that people could be Christians without necessarily being immersed. So he kind of left the door open to what later became the pious unimmersed. Now, a lot of other people did not take that position, even though Campbell was going in that direction. So first of all, there's that question of salvation. But the issue also was that as the disciples, as the Restoration movement looked at the New Testament, it was at the moment of immersion that God added someone to the church. So you have a salvation issue, but then also the question of, could someone be a member of a disciples' congregation if they had not been immersed? Because, a lot of the early converts to the Restoration movement were people that came from Baptist organizations who had been immersed. And quite frequently they were welcomed. But the question later became, as you interact with Presbyterians, with Methodists, with Episcopalians, others of these groups that do not practice immersion, nor do they practice adult baptism, what do you do about that when they want to become part of the Restoration movement? And they don't want to be immersed. They believe that their baptism is sufficient. Could a person be a member of a disciples' congregation without being immersed? Well, Isaac Arrett in the later 19th century kind of represents the position of the disciples for a while, in that he took the position that there might be Christians who were not immersed, but they were Christians in error, and that they had not fully.
I'm sorry, did you get an email?
Yes, about yes.
I think this part of the reason I'm late. I'm in the wrong attire. I apologize, online guys. Yes, sir. All right. Can we do some emailing?
Yes, we'll get in touch.
I know about the two papers that are once being worked on. Thank you, Dr. B.
You're welcome.
All right.
So Isaac Arrett takes the position of they might be Christians, but they're Christians in error, and they should not be admitted to congregations of disciples. They cannot become, a part of the Christian church, disciples of Christ. Now, the Churches of Christ wing tended to say that such unimmersed people are not Christians. They might be called by other terms, followers of Christ, other things like that, but you did not become a Christian in the Churches of Christ mindset from the late 19th century into the middle of the 20th century. You did not become Christian until you were immersed, and that was the moment when Christ added you to the church. So obviously, for the Churches of Christ, you could not be a member of one of those congregations if you had not been immersed. And sometimes, depending on the congregation, it was even an issue of if you had not been baptized for the remission of your if you had not been immersed for the remission of your sins, but that's the reason you're being immersed, then you needed to be immersed again. So you could be immersed as a Baptist. Well, a lot of Baptists by the late 19th, early 20th century did not baptize for the remission of sins. They baptized as the moment of joining the church. Salvation for a lot of Baptists took place at a different time. So salvation and baptism were often split in Baptist theology. And so a lot of people in the Churches of Christ said, baptism, you need to understand that baptism brings about salvation in order to have been baptized appropriately. All right, so you have the Churches of Christ that say they're not even Christians. You have this more moderate position of the disciples that says they might be Christians, but they cannot be members of a Disciples of Christ congregation. Other disciples, however, began practicing open membership, which essentially was the idea of that anyone that wanted to join a disciples' church could be a member of that congregation, with some accepting them fully, whether they had been immersed or not. Sometimes even whether they had been baptized or not. But in most cases, had they not been baptized, then there was the encouragement to be baptized because that was very important. But had you been sprinkled as an infant and wanted to become a member of the Disciples of Christ, some people were willing to open the possibility for that. So some were completely welcoming. You get full membership. Others, on the other hand, said you could have an associate type of membership, where you're not a full member of the congregation. You're considered a full member of whatever denomination you came from until you were immersed. And then you could fully become a member of this Disciples of Christ congregation. The Hyde Park Church of Christ in Chicago, which was affiliated with the Disciples despite the name Church of Christ, began in the 20th century to accept and practice all forms of baptism. And so that's even a further extreme. Not only, most Disciples of Christ churches were practicing immersion. So if you wanted to become a member of the Disciples of Christ and had not been baptized, you were immersed. But now you have this group in Chicago who is saying, we're open to any type of baptism, and even accept those people who have not been baptized at all. Now, largely by the 20th century, and as they are engaged in trying to cooperate with other groups, this is kind of encouraging this, right? This ecumenical outlook of, denomination. We're just one denomination among many that is part of the universal church. So, that's kind of pushing towards this position of accepting anyone's baptism, whether it was through immersion or whether it was through pouring or sprinkling, an infant or adult, because of wanting to take their place in this liberal Protestant world. It helped as well in a variety of missionary efforts. Now, as the disciples became more focused on missionary efforts, they were trying to find these ways to unify with other denominations. And so a union movement in China, missionary movement in China, offered the opportunity for the disciples to work with particularly Presbyterians and Congregationalists, but they would need some sort of formal statement from the disciples in order to be a part of the effort. Now, the United Christian Missionary Society wanted to be part of this effort to evangelize China, but they also know that if they participate in this, it is going to lead to a drop in funding because there would be a lot of congregations who would oppose it and would prevent people from contributing money to the United Christian Missionary Society. And so there was even an effort by some theological conservatives to withhold funding from the society until all of the missionaries who advocated open membership on the mission field were brought back. So if the missionary society knew that there was a missionary who was out there, whether that was China or India or somewhere else, practicing open membership, then the theological conservatives wanted that person pulled from the field, brought back to the United States, and someone else sent out. Ultimately, through a variety of the meetings of the International Convention of Christian Churches, these conservatives put forth a variety of resolutions to try and end this connection with these open membership missionaries. Now, the board of the United Christian Missionary Society, in trying to take this very pragmatic approach of trying to, find a middle course that's going to appease the open membership missionaries while also recognizing the concerns of the conservatives, just tries to do some song and dance with it, tries to avoid the issue. And conservatives really feel betrayed about this, that, here is this society that they are expected to support that is not, is not in line with their theological principles. In 1926, at the meeting of the International Convention, a report was circulated, and this caused even further controversy. But essentially the report said that all of those, or that essentially said that open membership was no longer practiced in China missions, that had been totally done away with. But the conservatives smelled a cover-up. They thought things were a little concerning with this, the likelihood that this had actually taken place. There were even reports that came out about people creating the report that members of that commission who were looking at the issue of open membership had encouraged the United Christian Missionary Society to pull certain missionaries home because they practiced open membership, to pull them home 2 months before they released this 1926 report that said no longer is open membership being promoted in China missions. And so as this kind of leaks out, the conservatives wonder, why wasn't this mentioned in this report? But it's kind of like, oh, well, no, this isn't happening anymore. And they're saying, this was just 2 months before this report was released, and people on the commission creating this report knew that this was taking place, that were involved in bringing missionaries home that practiced this. And, they were very concerned about it. Now, it appears that what had taken place was members of the commission are concerned about some of these missionaries. They encourage the society to bring them home. There's an investigation, and the missionaries are cleared, in a sense, that they were not advocating open membership. But they didn't include any of that in the report, which is what the problem was. It's that here is the report that basically states open membership is not an issue in the field with disciples missionaries. And so, the way it was handled is partly where the issue became. Ultimately, though, over a gradual period, most disciples' congregations in the United States adopted the practice. And so it started off as this kind of missionary practice, but eventually it works its way into local congregations. And ultimately, it seems to have been more of a pragmatic concern or a pragmatic development rather than a theological one. It's not that there is a deep theology being developed here by the disciples that calls for open membership. It was more of, this works, and this is successful, and this will help the disciples grow. That seems to have been more the thing that was pushing this forward, rather than any sort of theological position about salvation, about church membership, elements like that. Well, gradually the opposition, which is concerned about open membership, it's concerned about the ecumenical outlook of working with other congregations, it's concerned about the movement becoming just another denomination. Gradually that starts to coalesce. And so they too start their own convention. In 1927, a group was formed to create the North American Christian Convention. And the first meeting was to be in Indianapolis in 1927. Now, people that supported the International Convention of the Disciples of Christ looked at the North American Christian Convention as a protest movement. They don't like what's going on, and so they're trying to create a rival convention. They're trying to split the church. The conservatives, however, or the people that supported the North American Christian Convention, said, no, that's not what we're doing. Essentially, this is meant to be this rally to inspire. Right? Not going to deal with any business of churches. It's just going to be preaching, teaching, edification. It's going to be a gathering of individuals rather than a gathering of churches, which is what the International Convention was, delegates from different churches, whereas the North American Christian Convention was anybody who wants to come, feel free to come. And the focus was going to be encouraging commitment to the restoration plea for New Testament Christianity. And it was not going to be about church business or some of the other things that the International Convention focused on. So it's only on, issues of unifying the group, trying to talk about the Restoration plea. It's not business of the churches, which is what they saw the International Convention being. Now, it appears that there were some people that supported the North American Christian Convention, that while essentially this is about unity and to address some of the functions that conservatives wanted the International Convention to take, there were some conservatives, apparently, who were hoping that it was going to bring a schism, and it was going to split off and start that they would be the faithful remnant, so to speak, and that they would abandon the disciples. Most other people apparently wanted it to be more of a kind of a complement to the International Convention. So the International Convention focused on business, focused on agencies like the United Christian Missionary Society. North American Christian Convention more about education support, those kind of things. Well, now we're into the 1930s, 1940s, and these conventions are kind of running. The North American Christian Convention is not as regular as the International Convention. It's kind of every other year, every 3 years, not really a regular yearly thing. But there are a variety of other things that are taking place that are moving towards the disciples adopting a more denominational type of structure. And by the 1950s, there is a greater concern, a greater push for denominational structure. There were some within the disciples that wanted it to be a fully denominational group, some of which had been around for decades now. Well, out of this, a variety of committees were formed in the 1950s through the International Convention that was going to focus on a variety of elements that would address the identity of the disciples of Christ. And so in 1960, so there's a variety of things are brought forward, and finally in 1960, a commission is to examine church organization. It becomes known as the Commission on Brotherhood Restructure, or Restructure. This period of time is often known as restructuring in disciples' history. Eventually, it takes about 8 years for the commission to do its work, going over a variety of issues, and replacing the International Convention with the General Assembly. So instead of the International Convention of Christian Churches, Disciples of Christ, it would be the General Assembly, and the name as well would be changed from the International Convention of Christian Churches, Disciples of Christ, to Christian Church, parentheses, Disciples of Christ. That would be the new name of this organization. But still, it was meant to be this organization that was more advisory than legislative. So it's kind of taking some of the functions of the International Convention. It's consolidating a variety of things other efforts, and reconceptualizing some of the societies and divisions and all those different kind of things. So it leads to a restructure of the organization of the Disciples of Christ, which is the name I'll continue to use, even though the official name is Christian Church, Disciples of Christ. Well, this process of restructure leads to the finalization of the second split in the Disciples of Christ. Now, just like 1906 was the moment where it was finally spoken that there was a split in the Restoration movement, and there were two groups: Churches of Christ, Disciples of Christ. And this finalization, though, kind of hid the 40, 50 years that this split had been developing. The same thing's true with the disciples of Christ. Even though restructure is the moment where this final split takes place, this has been developing almost since the time of the division that happened between the disciples and the churches of Christ. The same kind of problems existed throughout the disciples' history, just as had been part of the larger Restoration movement history. But out of restructure, there is this separation between the Christian church disciples of Christ and what are frequently referred to as the independent Christian churches, or sometimes churches of Christ, or Christian churches / churches of Christ. Sometimes congregations of these independent Christian churches will have the name Church of Christ on their building sign. And you wouldn't know until you went in that, oh, this is actually the part of the Christian churches rather than part of the more traditionally named Churches of Christ, instrumental music being one of the main divisions. Some places, though the name Church of Christ or Churches of Christ is more prevalent than Christian church. So it of course does lead to some confusion among people. But what we're talking about, and that's why I'm going to use the term independent Christian churches to refer to this split from the disciples. Well, since the time of that North American Christian Convention being developed, there's been this fragmenting, this widening gap between the two groups. And essentially there are the three issues that we're talking about, that we've talked about before. First is this issue of modern biblical interpretation. So this division takes place over a long time, but a lot of the issue develops as that next generation, so now we're talking like the third, fourth generation of disciples, is coming to leadership positions in the colleges of the disciples wing of the Restoration movement. Places like the College of the Bible. Right? And we talked about the organization of that and how in the latter part of the 19th century, John McGarvey was the president. Well, McGarvey had stayed with the disciples, even though he was against instrumental music. He was for missionary societies. So he stays with the disciples wing, stays at the College of the Bible, even though there are some of his theological convictions that would have been more at home with the Churches of Christ. But one issue that he was particularly concerned about was higher criticism of the Bible, and was very active in writing and teaching against higher criticism. But he dies in 1911. And as newer professors come on, and so while McGarvey's alive, he's very active in making sure higher criticism doesn't get a foothold in the College of the Bible. But as these newer professors come on in the early 20th century, who are graduating from places that are supporting and promoting higher criticism, they are getting in institutions like the College of the Bible and promoting those ideas to that next wave of ministers. And so this issue of acceptance of liberal Protestantism, higher criticism, is very concerning to the older professors at the College of the Bible, the alumni of the College of the Bible, and this is just one organization out of the many that are part of the disciples. So many of the conservative supporters of the College of the Bible often turned to other Bible colleges that were in existence, or helped create new Bible colleges that they could put their support behind, as these current colleges tend to follow liberal Protestantism and higher criticism. So you have that. That's one of the issues. The other issue, of course, is the humanism of the disciples. the opposition to involvement in the Federal Council of Churches, many people on the liberal wing had seen this as a way to bring about unity. Others, the disciples were a founding part of the Federal Council of Churches, one of the founding organizations. And so, it's essentially, this is a support of the denominational approach to Christianity, which a lot of the conservatives were not willing to encourage. And then, of course, the issue of open membership. The Christian Standard, for example, was one of the major individuals or major journals that opposed the missionary approach, the missionary approach of open membership. And they become very concerned that the United Christian Missionary Society is not interested in following the desires of the broad movement. Instead, it's whatever the board members believe that guides the movement or guides the society instead of what the organization as a whole believes. And so, as we noted already, the conservatives start supporting missionaries independently instead of through the missionary society. So these churches eventually start conceiving of themselves as independent Christian churches instead of being part of the International Convention of Christian Churches, Disciples of Christ. Also, there tended to be a lot of sociology wrapped up with this as well. While there was some sectionalism between the Disciples of Christ and the Churches of Christ, the split between the disciples and the independent Christian churches tended to be along urban-rural lines. So the urban disciples tended to be the ones that were more liberal, more ecumenical in outlook, while the rural disciples tended to be the ones that were more supportive of an independent type of model. And so the Christian Standard is kind of the mouthpiece of all of this for this wing, this conservative wing of the disciples. This journal and the independent churches were trying to hold on to restorationism. The ideals of restorationism, congregational autonomy, where the disciples, the more liberal wing, doesn't seem to be as concerned about this by this point. And so the Christian Standard and other journals similar to it begin to try and produce rival materials, and like Sunday school materials, books, and other types of things, as an alternative to what's being done by the more liberal wing of the disciples. But all of this leads to an attempt to, try and prevent any splits, work together, talk about the issues, think about some ways to focus on what the disciples were all about. So, in 1934, the International Convention creates the Commission on Restudy of the Disciples of Christ. And essentially the idea was that this commission was going to examine the origins of the Restoration movement, its history, the slogans, the successes, the failures, all in an effort to think about how do we best maintain the unity of the disciples of Christ in the contemporary setting and work together. Right? Growing out of these tensions between the two groups. And so you have these various agencies and policies and missionary work and benevolence and education. And so what are the disciples all about? Is restorationism still valid? Is it something that should be adopted? And how does liberal biblical studies, higher criticism, how does that work? How does that shape the disciples of Christ? There are all sorts of issues that are being addressed here. The commission was made up of a very broad sampling of the various different constituencies of the disciples. Right? So you have theological conservatives, theological liberals, you have people from a variety of different institutions, pulled together about 37 on the commission, though people came on left at various times. Kind of had to stop serving, so other people were sought out. The commission met 3 times each year, beginning in 1934 and ending in 1948. One of those yearly meetings was related to the business of the society, or excuse me, the commission, and the other 2 were focused on the particular issue that they were examining, or issues they were examining that year. Apparently, very good relationship among the members of the commission. Even though they're coming from these different backgrounds, they seem to, evidence this good camaraderie. Essentially, the idea was that there would be a specific issue that would be discussed, and various members would be assigned to write a paper about it, which would be presented at one of the meetings. And in total, about 70 papers were presented on a variety of these different issues. There was some effort to include the churches of Christ as well, so that it's not just the disciples. There's some talk about, well, let's bring the churches of Christ in there. But other than 1 or 2 people, as far as like people that produce papers, there really isn't that substantial interest in talking with the disciples. By the 1930s, the majority of churches of Christ have taken a very hardline approach towards denominationalism, and especially towards the disciples. Almost to the point of, and probably in some cases there was, is rejection of any sort of connection as well. It's kind of historical amnesia of the relationship between these 2 groups. And so the churches of Christ don't really want to be involved in this. And so it's mostly just the theological liberals, theological conservatives. There were a variety of issues that were discussed. Things like whether the disciples of Christ was a movement or a denomination. Whether it's something within Christianity, trying to call people out of denominations, or it was an alternative to denominational Christianity. So there's that issue. Another issue was, does the New Testament provide a general order or a pattern for churches for all times? Or is there the opportunity for church structure, church organization to modify with the contemporary period, right? So is the New Testament a pattern, or is it just kind of more guidelines? Third issue was, how's the local church related to the universal church, right? How's the local congregation? Because when you read the New Testament, sometimes they're talking about a local congregation, and sometimes they're talking about the church universal. So how do those 2 things relate? What relationship does the universal church have with the local congregation? Another issue that was brought up was the conventions. What role should the conventions play? How should they participate in the lives of the disciples of Christ? The historical plea of the movement, is that still valid? Is that something that should be put forth? And a wide variety of issues related to doctrines. Now, all of these were meant to try and, it's rather expansive type of approach to try and deal with these issues that are causing some division. Well, as the commission started to wind down, it released a variety of reports. Specifically, the last 3 are ones we're going to look at: 1946, 1947, and then the final report in 1948. The 1946 report was focused on kind of a historical overview of the disciples of Christ, then also kind of thinking, that's where we've been, where are we now, and then also, where are we going? What are some things that we should hold on to? What are some things that we should abandon? What are some things we should adjust? In that report in 1946, there was divergence, differences. People had different positions on that. Not surprising with the theological liberals, theological conservatives. The 1947 report was essentially trying to lay out, all right, we have these factions within the disciples of Christ. Where are we in agreement? What are some places we can all agree on? And so things like, the importance of confessing Jesus as Lord as kind of the foundation for fellowship. If you don't confess Jesus as Lord, we don't even talk about fellowship isn't really worthwhile in that sense. Second thing was the idea of the New Testament as a primary source for knowing the will of God. I think that wording primary source is probably pretty important because probably some people understood primary source as the only source, while some other people probably thought of it as the primary source, but there are other sources. But essentially, they're agreed that the New Testament is the primary source for knowing God's will. Third thing where disciples were in agreement was the autonomy of congregations. Congregations were to be autonomous. The importance of preaching the gospel as a way to bring about unity. That God's plan of redemption is to bring about unity, right? So that if you participate in God's redemptive work, you are going to be unified with other people who are doing the same. As well as, there's some insights that the disciples have offered in the history of Christianity that were important. Things like the denominational nature of the church would have been one for some people, but the importance of unity would have been something that would have been important for other people. But essentially the idea was that the disciples had something to offer to the larger realm of Christianity. The 1947 report was the 1947 report also made a variety of suggestions. Here are some things that, while we have places of agreement, here are some things that we really need to consider. One was the importance of trying to find ways to foster unity. And that the churches needed to find ways and to talk about finding ways to be unified. Secondly was that churches needed to find ways and look at finding ways to overcome the divisions. Right? There's diversity among the disciples, so how do we get past that diversity and remain unified? Ultimately, the report encouraged that the disciples follow a motto that had been in use for a long time in the Restoration movement. Here it is: in faith, unity; in opinions, liberty; in all things, love. And that should be the guiding principle. That was a very important motto for the Restoration movement. Now, of course, the issue becomes, well, what does that mean? And what things are matters of faith and what things are matters of opinion, which are going to differ depending upon who you're talking about. But the final suggestion of the 1947 report was that there be a continual study of the New Testament church. That there's this need to continually, the disciples should frequently go back and look at that New Testament church and think about it and think about the relationship between the New Testament church and the disciples of Christ. The 1948 report, which was the final report, focused on what things that the Commission thought needed to be addressed immediately. And one thing was the nature of these places where there was agreement and disagreement. Are these matters of faith? Are these matters of opinion? Are these things that can be overlooked, or are these things that people need to change their opinion on, or you need to change their view on this? A second thing that the 48 report said was that there needs to be immediate attention to how can the fellowship of the disciples of Christ be preserved. It's very easy for the fragmentation that's happening to be a full break. So how do we keep it from becoming a full break? And thirdly, disciples need to know more of the history of the movement. And there's some important historical contributions that people have made in the past. And disciples need to know that. They need to know who we are and where we came from. And so that was the final major suggestion out of the 1948 report. Largely, the report's bad. they're ignored by groups on both ends, right? So you kind of have these moderates of the liberal end and moderates of the conservative end that have come together, and then the real hard-nosed people on the liberal end and the conservative end, they don't care to hear what the commission is trying to say. They feel that, to adopt any sort of moderating type tone is to kind of give in to the other side. And even the International Convention doesn't really do much with it, doesn't really try to make any sort of effort. And so, there's no solution that's made. One recommendation that was made by the Commission was that the International Convention and the North American Christian Convention be held back to back. And so you could get both of you'd have the business end, and then you'd have the more inspirational edification end. Well, that was lots of opposition from both sides on that issue as well. So you have this, attempt to try and maintain unity, but it just falls apart. Beginning in the 1940s and moving on, you have a variety of things that take place. On one hand, you have journals like the Christian Standard who print up a list of saying, here are the faithful congregations, here are the faithful members, which meant theologically conservative, within the Disciples of Christ. And so if the name wasn't on that list, they were not faithful. Well, that actually pushes the International Convention to be more interested in open membership, right? And so maybe the conservatives thought this would encourage people to be conservative. It actually encourages the opposite. In 1950, the North American Christian Convention moves from being this sporadic organization to yearly meetings, which from that time on, it's evolved and changed from what it was in 1950. But it's still, the focus is, it's not about doing any sort of business. Eventually, as well, another convention is created by the more conservative wing, known as the National Missionary Convention, which was to provide missionaries, particularly those independent missionaries, a national platform promoting their work, promoting the importance of missions in a way different than the United Christian Missionary Society. The idea was that the convention will not have any authority over missionaries. It's just the time to promote specific missionaries for people to think, okay, maybe our congregation needs to support this person, and encouraging just an interest in missionaries and preaching and teaching. And that's all that it was meant to be, is put. But it is, of course, another organization that is in opposition to the United Christian Missionary Society and the International Convention. And so the fulfillment of this split takes place around restructure. Now, the disciples had been publishing a yearly or an annual thing called the Yearbook of the Disciples of Christ since the time of the 19th century, listing churches, ministers, educational programs, etc. So congregations associated with the Disciples of Christ, and then the Christian Church, Churches of Christ, the Christian Church, Disciples of Christ. But beginning in 1955, there was this other work, the Directory of Ministry, which was focused more on the theologically conservative congregations and ministers. And so it's still around today for the Christian churches, the independent Christian churches. And it included the same kind of things: numbers, statewide membership, church listings, what chaplains were involved in various hospitals, military organizations, the radio and TV ministries of the Christian church, the independent Christian churches, as well as missionaries, other information. But it was in 55 it starts, but it's predominantly these theological congregations. And then after a restructure takes place, many of those congregations says, you know what, take me out of the Disciples' Yearbook. And so there's this sizable migration of people that take place, that they don't want to any longer be included in the yearbook of the disciples of Christ. The beginning of the 20th century, with the split with the Churches of Christ, the disciples had started out with about 1 million members. In restructure, even though the movement has grown some, in restructure, 750,000 of them, about 3,500 congregations, leave for the independent Christian churches. So, sizable group follows the theological conservative split in migration from the disciples of Christ into these officially recognized independent churches. Well, that finishes us up with the disciples of Christ in the 20th century. Again, we're winding down. We only have 2 more weeks of classes, so we'll pick up again on Tuesday.